So without further ado, Chandler.
So one of the things that I think I learned today is that the idea of arts infrastructure isn't such a foreign concept to at least the people that we have here in the room. That probably has something to do with the fact that we all thought that a Saturday morning in the summer was worth coming to a program like this. So I'm going to try and speed through some of the presentation that I think will be redundant to some of these conversations that we had in the breakouts earlier, and kind of elaborate on some of the data that I think we need to be able to use when we are collectively advocating for things like new ways to fund projects and advocating for projects in general. So I hope that this information becomes a resource. You'll see a link at the end of this from which you can go and re-see these things, and also a Pinterest board that has all of the reports that we used primarily in putting this together. So yeah, hopefully it'll be a resource for that. So a little bit about me. I'm the founder of Studio Teal. This is sort of a culmination for me of 10 years of working in the creative field between business and actually creative production. I've sat in a lot of different places. I've worked in a lot of different industries, and kind of been able to see from a macro perspective similarities and differences and the different types of languages and things, incentives, mechanisms that drive those different industries. I've worked in film, fashion, art, in the art world when I lived in New York, in the art world here in Detroit, and a number of different things, including a dance party. Some of you know about this thing called Haute to Death. That's me and my partner Ash. We've been at Temple Bar for 8 years, and aside from a passion for music and DJing, the art form of DJing, I've also learned what a great social mechanism it is at bringing people together around a social object like music, and all of the different sort of things that can come out of that aren't just a night of celebration and fun, social connections and so forth. So every month we redesign a record cover. Our parties are really wild. You've probably been to some of them, just based on the familiar faces in the room, so I don't need to talk about that more. Something that has really shaped a lot of the ideas that I have today from my own experiences. Coming back to Detroit from New York, I lived there for a short time when I was doing a residency program through Parsons during college. I took some time off before coming back to Detroit, and I worked, I sort of got this lucky opportunity to work in a very sort of elite sphere of the art world. I worked for an artist named Doug Aiken on a commission he was doing for MoMA, and for a period of months my life was surrounded by really crazy major art world players that gave me a sort of crash course on the inside mechanisms that really drive the commercial art world as we know it and as we participate with it in epicenters like New York. And coming back to Detroit, for me, I was very infatuated with that the taste of New York art world that I got, and it felt very enlightened, and it felt very sophisticated and all these things. It felt like it was it, right? The thing that is to be aspired to. And then when I came back to Detroit, I saw a lot of my friends who were opening their own galleries and doing projects in alternative spaces, and oftentimes putting their own resources, their own money, and their own time into projects that's not having any real support. I wasn't seeing the long-term equitable sort of benefit coming out of them, not in the short term. And when you talk about the cost of putting your cost of your time into these things, not really seeing them getting the return in the long run. But I was seeing a lot of people utilizing the resources that Detroit has to their advantage. And we identified these in our breakout groups earlier, so I'll breeze through these. Obviously space, physical and mental. We have the talent that's here. Maud touched on this earlier, the international intrigue on Detroit, the shine's not going to stay on the apple for very long, so we really are, as a community, in a critical time to come together around this issue of building infrastructure and advocating for ourselves. And another thing that's really unique about the Detroit art world versus say the quote-unquote international art world is that we have a meaningful contribution to be making that lives outside of the hyper-capitalist art world, where we're getting to the point where collectors are celebrities and celebrities are artists, and not that there's necessarily anything wrong with these things, but it's just definitely skewed the value system of art. And really the opportunity we have is to capitalize on re-purifying the art world. And instead of aspiring necessarily towards following the methodologies for success in other major art hubs, we have the opportunity to create our own methodologies. And that's the thing that's really exciting to me, and I know a lot of you also feel the same way. And another thing that we also have the opportunity for, and we need to rally for more and more, is ownership. That's property, that's intellectual property, and it's collective ownership of things. I'll give a quick story of a good friend of mine his name is AJ Pachka. He's a central figure in the Grand Rapids art scene. And about 10 years ago, him and about 200 other artists banded together and advocated for a subsidized artist lives workspace. And if you've been in Grand Rapids, you'll across from one of these funny clubs that they have is this whole strip of these really beautiful loft upstairs, workspace downstairs, and it's become such an economic driver for Grand Rapids, and the art scene has. And it really started with this group getting together and advocating for the studio space. So it really created a place downtown that people wanted to be, and it really pushed the economic development narrative. Now what happened over the last 10 years was, especially in 2008, it got a little dodgy because the local community partner, the bank that was funding the project, ended up sort of getting switched over to a national bank that didn't really have the same interests as the local community bank. And so the agreements towards ownership of the space that was going to be granted over time were then eliminated. And also certain things like there's like so part of their program is if you hit a certain cap in your income, then your rent level changes, which is all fine and good, but it wasn't structured in a smart way. So AJ actually was able to, over the course of 10 years, go from making around $20,000 a year to be making over $40,000 a year. But in the middle there, when he finally crossed over, which it was like $37,000 a year income, when he crossed over that, his rent changed more than the amount that he was making, and he had to leave. So it ended up being a net negative. And so this is just one example of why we really need to think about ownership in terms of gaining the equity that comes with the cultural capital that we provide. So we do need to think more long-term about our careers and what we're putting out there. And like I said, this is our opportunity to redefine and elevate, because we do have this attention on Detroit right now and its art scene. We have the opportunity to sort of add our own forms of credibility that exist outside of the art market, that don't have to do with a robust collector base and don't have to do with the tried and true methodologies. And this is not to say that those aren't, the gallery structure and collecting and all these things absolutely necessary. They're a part of the art world. They're not the only thing. And Detroit really has, I think, the opportunity to become known for this. And so this is the way art intersects with urbanism, the way it can participate in economic development, which I'll talk a little bit more in a moment, the way that social justice issues can be incorporated with art. An example of this, I think, is actually really slick in a way, is the Nick Cave Here series of exhibitions, because, yes, they're in Cranbrook, they're in Campus Martius, they're in DeQuintercut, and they're in the Ruth Ellis Center. And I think in particular, the collaboration with the Ruth Ellis Center was a really slick way to bring up awareness of potentially how the social justice thing works for the LGBTQ community in a really slick way. It talks about that politics through the work, through the culture, without necessarily having it be an article or an angry disposition, which actually is totally relevant and necessary, but it's almost, it's a different mechanism. And I thought that was one that was really a standout to me, but as an example of how art and civic engagement can overlap in a very Detroit way. And also, this is an example of how we can get art into people's lives in a different way. Bringing people out into communities that they wouldn't necessarily have access to. When you put the social object of art in between them, between you and other people, I always say music, food, and art are the three great equalizers. You can put them between two people from different cultures, and you have something to come together on. You have some way to relate to it that's not me versus you. It's here's how I interpret this thing, here's how you interpret that. And that's a really powerful force, as we know. But for us to really achieve this radical new ideal, which isn't that radical, but it's radical in comparison to what we actually have now, we need the infrastructure to support it. We're not reinventing the wheel. We need the wheel, and that's sort of what we're missing. So this question of what is our infrastructure has been on an ongoing dialogue between Dominic and I over the last month putting this presentation together. It is sort of nebulous, and just judging on our breakout groups earlier today, I think we do have some sense of that, but I'd like to just take some inventory. What is infrastructure? Someone in the audience, give me an example of an infrastructure. A network, sure. Space is absolutely an infrastructural element.
All aspects of transportation.
Transportation is a city infrastructure, for sure. What else goes into an art infrastructure?
Education,
Training, education, absolutely. Industry knowledge, for sure.
The advocacy group.
Advocacy group is a huge one, yeah. Policy. Yes, absolutely. That's like the most obvious one. So, these are things that exist around us, and we maybe don't see necessarily as connected, but they really are. Through the conversations that Dominic and I had, here's sort of the cursory list, what we identified as the, Dominic, what's the term you use again? The basic, the square one of what we should have to have a thriving infrastructure. So councils and boards. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to put, you said it in such a way, and I'm forgetting the term you used. But councils and boards from which to communicate between the ground level and the powers and decision makers that be. Arts facilitation, this is one that came up in one of the groups, having somebody attached to your projects that knows PR, that knows marketing, that knows strategy and production. Just because you can create the work doesn't mean that you have the capacity. Not like you can't do that, but that you don't have the space to really be creating the work and also producing it and facilitating it. We're used to all doing these things, but we'll be stronger, we'll make stronger work if we allow that room. Housing and studio space. We have so much space here and so many buildings that could be, tremendous assets, and I think we're on the way to that. You know, I think Galapagos might potentially be an example of that, and some of the other galleries that are coming into town might be able to provide that. Subsidies and policies to make these things happen. You know, we give subsidies and policies all the time to developers and builders. You know, we should be doing that to build for our arts ecosystem. And tourism planning is also a huge thing. Arts tourism is a huge driver, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but you know, these are things that will add strength to our community. Co-working space, arts promotion, obviously funding, and industry partnerships. We did talk a lot about this idea that we are often so siloed in our different divisions of art and within our divisions, within our social scenes, within that division. And so these partnerships are something we can do, and of course education. You know, so through having these conversations with Dominic and going back and forth, we realized it was actually quite valuable to have like a baseline sort of lexicon to operate off of. So when we're talking about you know, what we're trying to support the art ecosystem. And the ecosystem is all of us. It's the artists, producers, the facilitators, administrators, it's the foundations, it's museums, galleries, collectors, the patrons, the curators, the schools, the government, and the policymakers. It's that big sort of petri dish that is like the, you know, Metro Detroit area that we operate in. So if we understand it as such and all connected, you know, we can rally for, again, the infrastructure from which to support those things. So a project of mine that is sort of, we're a year out now, we sort of did a pilot of this thing, was looking at this idea of infrastructure for funding projects. And this came up a number of times in both of the breakout groups earlier, was this feeling of a disconnect between the ground level artists and the institutional players like the foundations and museums that have power to fund projects. And the new Colossus was addressing just that. It was addressing risk aversion in the funding community and addressing that disconnect. And so, you know, we were able to secure some sort of essentially like seed capital for a test pilot of this concept of funding in small amounts, sub $5,000, to arts, experimental art projects that sit sort of at the intersection of art, urbanism, and social impact. And it was really interesting. There's a couple of things that we learned. One, money isn't the answer. It's part of the answer, but it's not the only answer. And two, facilitation needs to be partnered alongside that funding. So, you know, a little bit of the backstory, we funded 3 projects, one that was in Banglatown, one that was in the Recycle Center Art Park, Lincoln Street Art Park, and one at the Bog School. And we had one that was just like, okay, one that was a learning curve, and one that actually allowed one of the projects to raise more money from the sort of seed capital experimentation approach. And, you know, what we found was without the support that went along with the funding, it was really hard to necessarily activate. So one of them was a program at the Bog School by Brent and Brian of Passalaqua to run a media studio within the Bog School to help kids get their hands on technology and to learn that they can mediate their ideas through technology. And one of the funny things is when we wrote them a check, we're like, okay, next steps, what's going on? They're like, oh, we're gonna have the kids tell this kind of story, and you know, we wanna have them like do this thing with the green screen and you know, this thing. And I was like, whoa, 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 what camera are you gonna buy? Where's the green screen coming from? Like, let's talk about that. And so, you know, it's this really, you know, such a touching, beautiful proposal that we received from them. And we are are so passionate about their cause and all of the things that that project is able to do. But it wasn't until we said, okay, like, let's work with you to actually put a spreadsheet together, to know how these funds are being allocated, to put a proposal around it, so that we actually got a lot of in-kind donations for it. And again, we're still in the pilot phase of this, of understanding how to fund these interesting experimental projects, that don't have the brand equity, that don't necessarily have a proven track record or haven't, been done. And so we're working in this sort of design thinking, testing an assumption, learning from that. Did it work? Did it not work? Why did it not work? And using that as a sort of data source in and of itself that is attached to the granting. So that wasn't meant to exactly be a huge part of this talk, but I do feel like, per what we were talking about earlier, I hope some of those learnings can, at least enrich. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but we have a few more things that I want to go into, which is the data. There's actually a lot of other arts council types organizations in many other cities. There's a great report by the RAND Corporation, which is linked at the end here. And they talk a lot about how the successes that they've seen in arts infrastructure in other cities. And so I'm going to go through some of these things. The key elements of strong cultural support is an art organizational structure, something like an arts council. We've talked a lot about this in our groups earlier today. Integrating the arts with city goals. So things like economic development and tourism are huge. Building collaborative relationships between the various stakeholders. We talked about that a lot in the group earlier. Shared services. This is something that can be as simple as promotions. It can be a rental agency. It can be creating a more structured barter system amongst your cohort, the creative community. And for an arts council to work, it needs to be a visionary leadership. We need representation on these boards and in these decision making from the ground level, as well as people who can pull through the bureaucratic process. The way a lot of the other cities, oftentimes they're publicly funded through the city budget. However, North Carolina, for example, also has a privately funded arts council that does quite well. That was Charlotte, North Carolina. And these organizations, the Arts Council organization is a strategic and vision planning for the entire arts sector. And they sort of re-grant public funds, so typically it comes from a percentage of the city budget. They can advocate for the policy work that needs to be done, things like artist studios and decriminalizing certain art acts and so forth. And they're also a liaison between the city, the arts, and neighborhood and cultural district development, which is huge. Philadelphia is a perfect example of that, thanks to Maud being here earlier. That was really cool that she got to do that. Public arts facilitation, so making these projects happen on the non-creative side, and catalyzing relationships. And again, these organizations can't just be the run-of-the-mill city organization. They really need to sit in between the arts community and the bureaucratic process. So there needs to be vision, and it needs to attract all of the other arts work, all of the other sector to participate, not because they need to, but because they want to. And so, these 6 points that I just brought up are categories of what the RAND study qualifies as like best-in-class arts councils. So currently in Detroit, and we've all recognized this, it's cobbled together. There is not an infrastructure. Dominic and I had a chance to talk with, in a totally random chance meeting at MOCAD, this lovely man named Tony Allegretti, who is the executive director of the Jacksonville, Florida's Arts Council. And he has been a totally open book to us and given us lots of advice and documents and things to look at. it was weird to meet him, but it's also weird that we have a similar situation to Jacksonville, Florida. I would have never looked at Jacksonville and thought, oh yeah, we have similarities like to model off of, but we totally do. You know, they're a city with a lack of collector base. Lots of creative people live in Jacksonville and work. They have a whole sort of district called Cork that is an artist hub, and they have a need for accelerated civic renewal. Their downtown is not different than Detroit's in terms of needing a renewal structure, and they have used arts in a major way to revitalize their downtown. So differences, obviously, Detroit actually has, this is a benefit to us in my opinion, we have 5 times the population density of Jacksonville. Jacksonville is a huge city. It's actually sort of like our metro Detroit area, which means so it's a consolidated city. All of the different counties are a part of Jacksonville, so that makes it a little bit different. Detroit has a more recognizable brand than Jacksonville, so that works to our advantage. And also, Jacksonville is able to do these things in a very politically conservative atmosphere where we actually have a pretty democratic leaning political system. So the way theirs works is they get 0.0027, so that's basically 1/4 of 1% of the city budget. It's tiny. It's like a blip on the radar, but it accounts to being $2.7 million that they get to, that the city is putting into their arts ecosystem every year. The main function is re-granting to 23 organizations and also facilitating public arts projects as well as the maintenance that goes into them. And through a partnership with their local university, they did an economic impact study and found that for every dollar that the city puts into into the arts infrastructure, they get $29 back. So they turn $2.7 million of city money into $70 million into the economy. Their organization is fully transparent. It's a mechanism of keeping people honest and to follow through with the things they say they're going to do. And they find that it's a major driver of jobs and community investment. They're constantly leveraging art data, which there's more and more becoming available these days. And one thing that they really wanted to improve and are trying to find ways to is, they do a similar program to our Kresge Arts Fellows, and they want to actually find ways to, instead of giving one artist a large sum of money, to give, lots of sub $5,000 grants very easily to many small projects, rather than large sums to a small amount. Art perception in Detroit. We talked a little bit about this in our different breakout groups. I'd just like to take a poll to see how accurate we feel that these things are. Raise your hand if you agree that the arts leadership and city leadership see art as a non-essential city function. Okay, that's most of us. See art as a luxury rather than an investment. Again, that's a little more. Not relevantly connected to broader city goals. Agree or disagree? 50-50. As anchor institutions more worthy of funding than small institutions. Okay? And small and mid-sized organizations are hard to fund. Cool, about 50-50 on that. The numbers are quite staggering. The NEA just did a study over the last few years that was released, I think this year or late last year, showing what just an economic driver the arts and culture industry is to the nation. It's $700 billion go through the economy from the arts and culture segment, which makes up 4.2% of our gross national product, which is greater than individually construction, transportation, and warehousing. Think about that for a moment. Larger than construction, transportation, and warehousing. $2.5 billion go into Michigan every year from tourism. It makes up 18% of tourism in Michigan, which is a larger percentage than sporting events, golfing, boating, hunting and fishing, hiking and biking combined. So we really need to be looking at the impact of arts and culture as a major driver of bringing dollars from other places into our economy. That actually is another net positive from an economics point, that we're bringing more dollars into our own economy, which gets spent either on local business, parking, admission to different things, and then those dollars then go again through to your grocery store, into your bank, into your, it just adds to the economy, what we have to play with. And lastly, $565 million go into nonprofits, arts-based nonprofits, and close to 200 million of those are salaries. That's making our economy sustainable. It's a small, in the grand scheme of things, a small number, but it's important to understand these numbers when we're talking about how arts can drive progress. I've sort of gotten to hit on some of these. Obviously, talent attraction and retention is a huge thing for our city. We are still losing more people as we are gaining, but arts is one of the main drivers of talent attraction. People want to go place where there's actual culture to participate in. Without that, you don't really have necessarily the same drive. And education, arts education is has a huge impact, and it gets cut a lot, but really the studies have found that art students with music or arts education have a 30% higher likelihood to go to college, not just to graduate, but to go to college. So in our groups earlier, we talked a lot about these partnerships between different cultural organizations, between each other. We all absolutely realize the importance of that, but promotion is a huge thing that's missing from the arts ecosystem. And the more we can promote art in general, rather than our own institutions, our own things, the more it'll drive traffic to arts attention on Detroit. I believe it was St. Louis used a similar approach, sort of like the analogy to be made is, when in the 90s when the milk producers of America banded together and made the Got Milk campaign, it wasn't like, oh, go get Calder Dairy. It was like bringing milk back onto the American dinner table, and it was widely successful. So this is also a strategy that can work for, Detroit as an arts city, Detroit as a music city, Detroit as a culture city. So if we really look at it as, well, here's my thing and here's everything else, or here's a unified resource to go to, which is greatly lacking, as we identified in our group earlier. These types of things happen through partnership. Another thing that we kind of need to realize is that we're on the verge of a freelancer explosion. This is going to be a nationwide thing. By 2020, it's expected that 50% of the workforce will be operating as freelancers. Now, this statistic, I believe, is probably already in place in Detroit, if not more. Understanding the freelancer economy is going to be huge for being able to advocate for small projects. So in a lot of ways, arts is up ahead of the curve on this trend, as being self-employed, highly specialized workers. And so, the future may be bright in our context of having an arts career. There will be a larger understanding of how to work with freelancers. But we do need to get ahead of the curve on supporting and creating an infrastructure from which, a independent artist, independent worker can thrive in the economy. So I'm going to leave it here. I really appreciate your time. This is a huge data overload. I understand that. I hope that we can utilize the research that we've done. Again, this is the link, bit.ly/art numbers. It just links to a Pinterest board that I made that has all of the reports that we used in creating this presentation, as well as a link to this presentation. So thank you guys very much for your time.